So, Travis Brown, thank you for joining me today. I'm excited for our conversation. You're a filmmaker, Travis, and you're putting out a documentary series called Uncomfortable Truths about gender ideology. So, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about what inspired this series and kind of what's behind you working on that?
Yeah, what inspired the series is, I guess there are multiple things. One, I grew up with fundamentalist Christians in a pretty cult-like environment, and so I've been fascinated by, and I left that behind, and so I've been fascinated ever since then with how ideology shapes our view of reality and how it motivates people to act in really kind of bizarre or extreme ways. And that led me to make a series on wokeness more generally. So I had a whole series called the Woke Reformation, where I talked about the religious aspects of far left or critical social justice ideology, and then I was just going to cover gender as another topic within that umbrella. But it's such a complex topic, and there were so many different people for me to talk to that I decided to kind of branch off and make another series on gender ideology. So there's that, and there's just the fact that when I started studying what was happening, this seemed to be the worst aspect of wokeness. I mean, people were defunding the police, and so people were literally dying as a result because, like, for instance, in Portland, they got rid of the gun violence reduction team, and more people started getting shot, and so there are real world effects to this, but more directly, parents and people are harming children in these insane ways when it comes to gender, and they believe that they're being inclusive and progressive by doing so. So that is one, horrifying, and two, fascinating. And so I'm just always interested in how people can get to these places, and so that's why I'm making the documentaries, to help people understand what's going on and to realize that, like, the what's happening in particular to kids and also to women and women's spaces is something that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're putting it out in a series, right?
Yeah, yeah.
hmm And you've got the first episode out so far, right, on Locals?
Yeah, it's done. It's on locals. I'm still waiting to do a bigger launch once I have some more of the series done. I am excuse me. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to release it, but I have a plan to try to get some a broader audience for it.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So, yeah, I watched episode one on Locals. It was really excellent, really well done. After watching last year the Matt Walsh documentary, What is a Woman, it had a tiny bit of a reminder of that for me, but it
Mm,
feels like more of a slow burn, which I really like. And in terms of, a little bit of like that drama and that the scary aspect of it, like you're talking about, it really is a nightmarish story when you start looking at pediatric gender medicine.
yeah, I mean, they're literally altering their bodies in ways that they cannot come back from. I mean, kids are being literally sterilized, losing sexual function, etc. As you know. So yeah, to me, I mean, this seems to be the most horrifying incarnation of identity politics out there that I'm aware of.
hmm And you live in Portland, right?
Not anymore, thankfully. A few months
Okay.
ago, I moved out. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do you want to share where you live now, or is that more private?
Yeah, I like to keep it private because people tend to, dox people like me. And as a matter of fact, I think on a certain transgender activist website, I found I have two entries on that website with links to a bunch of stuff. And yeah, so
Oh,
thankfully
God.
all those addresses are out of date. But yeah.
hmm Yeah, no, they're absolutely terrible. I mean, doxing is a real problem. I have a friend who got swatted actually. So, yeah, it's really frightening.
What is
And
swatted?
then oh, so swatted is it's like doxing on another level. It's where they
Hmm.
actually the activists from behind their keyboards, they will call the like FBI and they will
Oh
say this
wow.
person is a terrorist or this person is going to kill somebody and then they'll actually so my friend they actually showed up to her and her husband's house with guns
Wow.
like these armed officers and
Jeez.
Yeah, and it's really, and they've like killed people's dogs before because when they come into the house,
Jesus.
the first thing they do is shoot the dog,
Oh man,
and
that would be
it's so
unforgivable.
awful. Yeah, yeah, exactly, unforgivable,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, and in that in her situation, they sorted everything out. It was actually her husband's online activity,
Okay.
but because he liked political stuff, but yeah, it's terrifying, and they managed to sort everything out. Luckily, in
Mm,
that case, they explained everything, and then they
right.
were able to get the police to try to track down the perpetrators, but they haven't been able to
Wow.
find them.
He must
So,
have he must have been a member of the dreaded patriarchy.
yeah, I mean, you would think so, right? So, it was, well, yeah, I guess I won't say too many details just because we don't
Sure.
want to, put them on blast, but um yeah, so that's really definitely understand, keeping that private. That's smart. And but did you go to a university in Portland?
Yeah, I went to a tech school quite a few years back, and but nothing to do with film. So yeah, but I lived in Portland for like 16 years or so. So I
Okay.
saw how it used to be, and then how it slowly changed over the years, and got to the point of just being an insane, unsafe, deranged place.
Yeah. So what was that like seeing that kind of like transformation?
Yeah, it was it was sad. I mean, I think the seeds for this kind of derangement were always there because it's full of these sort of hippie, artsy people that just sort of allow anything to go. And in in some regards, that's it's nice. There's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of like openness, or at least I came to discover it's more like a pseudo openness and a pseudo kindness, because as soon as you start to step outside of the tribe and you maybe don't agree with everything that the progressives are pushing, then you find yourself on the outskirts very quickly. So yeah, it's been sad to watch. I mean, I would say since about 2011 it started going downhill, but really when Trump was nominated and then won, that's when it really got chaotic. I mean, we had riots and fires in the street even back in 2017. So before COVID, before George Floyd, and then it just ramped up to the nth degree in 2020, and there was something like 150 days of straight rioting. Not just people holding signs, which is fine, totally fine to protest, but people beating up cops, beating up regular pedestrians, these witch hunts. I mean, burning down businesses, literally killing people. So yeah, it's a horrible, horrible place.
Wow, okay. Yeah, I've never been there, but I do live in California, so
Yeah.
we have our own issues. And
Right.
when you were there, I mean, were you were you surrounded by people who were buying into these ideas, this ideology, or were you kind of insulated from it? Like, what was it like for you if you were to, ask questions about it or challenge it? You obviously don't agree with the ideology. So, what was it like for you kind of socially in Portland?
Yeah, yeah. For whatever reason, whatever community I'm in, I always find myself on the outskirts or being sort of pushed out. I mean, the same thing happened when I was growing up with Christians. I would ask questions, even though maybe I agreed with a lot of the fundamental tenets, but just even asking questions can get you in trouble. And the same thing was certainly true in Portland. Asking questions or maybe making a joke here and there that's not politically correct. And then eventually, when it came to 2020, I was one of the very few people online and in person with my friend group that was like, "Hey, what are you all doing? Like, how is this okay to be, attacking cops? I mean, they were literally attacking cops with hammers, and they were shooting lasers into their eyes to blind them, and they were setting off bombs, and I mean, all these poor people that were living downtown were just miserable. I interviewed a few of them, but yeah, so speaking out against that, even some of my close friends had bought into some of it because almost everyone was kind of swept up. I mean, they were bored and feeling anxious because of COVID and the lockdowns, and then George Floyd happened, and everyone kind of rallied behind this new movement, or at least it was new to them. Perhaps the movement has been happening for a long time, but it really exploded in 2020. And so, yeah, thankfully, I was able to keep most of my good friends, but I definitely had quite a few people who were angry with me or who don't talk to me anymore. Or, like in the past, I could go talk to anyone in the film industry and either hire them or, use their equipment or rent, studio space or whatever. And then after 2020, I started to run into all these problems where, oh, we're not going to rent to Travis. We're not going to rent the studio to Travis because he's a bigot, he's a transphobe, he's a racist, even though they had no evidence for any of that.
Yeah, did that impede your career?
I mean, yeah, it definitely made things more challenging. It was more on a personal level. I mean, you can always find another studio or find ways to fix that, but I just began to realize, especially in about 2021, that I had almost like this weird reputation of being bigoted and just not going along with this orthodoxy. And so on a personal level, it was more just I had a lot of anxiety, a lot of anxiety, a lot of sleepless nights, and I was basically living in my bed because I had horrible back pain during that time. So it was psychologically challenging on many levels.
What was the thing that made it the most psychologically challenging? Was it the people canceling, doing stuff with you that you had planned, or saying no to you, or calling you a bigot?
I I think it was a combination of things. I mean, I'm friends with Andy No and obviously Peter Boghossian and other people who've been both harassed and physically attacked by Antifa. So that was my worst fear was kind of just percolating in my mind all the time. And again, I was incapacitated because I was in pain. So I was thinking, well, I can't even really defend myself. And so it was really an accumulation of like, okay, I have this reputation that's coming up of me being some far right whatever, and Antifa is willing to call anyone they disagree with far right or Nazi and therefore hurt them. So yeah, that was probably the worst part of it. Was worrying that I mean I moved out of Portland into a smaller city in 2021, but I was still very close to downtown Portland. So I was a little bit more secured, but yeah, I'm happy to be completely away from it so that I just don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah, definitely. The threat is very real, very stressful. So I'm curious about your background with fundamentalist Christianity. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. Anything specific you want to know, or just the general
Well,
experience?
what kind of environment did you grow up in? Were you guys part of a church? Was it just you and your parents? Like, what was the structure?
Yeah, we were part of a non-denominational church. I think my parents still go to that, and it was strangely situated, I suppose. I lived out in the middle of nowhere with only like a couple neighbors, so we were physically isolated, and then we were, psychologically and emotionally isolated in the sense that I wasn't allowed to watch or listen to, you know, music that was non-Christian, and the movies that I could watch were very few. And so every my sort of experience with and connection to the outside world was very walled off, and so that was hard. And then also even the two neighbors that I had, I wasn't allowed to spend much time with one of them at all because he wasn't a Christian. And then the other one, who was my best friend, there were times where I wasn't only allowed to see him like once a week, even though, we were born 5 days apart, and he's my best friend living right next to me. So yeah, it was really challenging. And then it was just, every little thing, even if I disagree with my dad, for instance, on something that the Bible said, or I just had a slightly different interpretation of it, which is what you see with the trans activist stuff. Just having a slightly different take would get you in trouble, and to the point of my parents telling me that I was deceiving myself and that my heart was evil and wicked. I mean, there's verses in the Bible that talk about that, and so they would just use those kinds of those bits of scripture to just reinforce how wrong I was. And it was constant. I was constantly worried about this idea of going to hell. Hell was a very real place for me, and I very much believed in it. And so it was really, It was horrible. And so the same thing kind of now happens, except now rather than being told that you're going to burn forever, you're just told that you're a bigot and your life here on earth is going to suck because we're going to, cancel you or try to get rid of your job or whatever. So in a way it's almost, I mean, it's hard to say what's worse because the idea of eternal torment is pretty horrible, but at the same time, like ruining your life now or going after you now is also really challenging.
Yeah, I mean, even the word cancel, and that word does come from, originally the people who were doing it. They were the ones who invented, cancel culture. And that word implies such a severe reaction. Like you are canceled, not what
Yeah,
you're doing, not your events, but you as a person are canceled.
right.
And that is what they set out to do a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And then, so how old were you when you kind of broke away? I know you talk about in your documentary series that this was something that obviously deeply affected you in your view now of what you're working on. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about what it was like to break away from that.
Yeah, it was a slow process. It took me years to kind of leave it behind, but in my early excuse me, in my early teens, I think is when I first started to kind of question the morality of the Bible and the things that I was taught. But I still believed in it. I still believed in a God and heaven and hell and all of that, and in Jesus. But it's just slowly became more and more uncomfortable for me, and people couldn't answer my questions in a way that was satisfactory. And so, through a lot of questioning and a lot of doubting, I would say I was probably about 19 or 20 when I just decided I can't in good conscience continue to believe these things or continue to devote myself to this or pray anymore. Even though the threat of hell was still looming in the background, I was still worried that I was going to go to hell if I turned my back on God. But I did it anyways because I didn't feel like it was authentic or sincere, and so that was really terrifying. And then thankfully, I learned through the study of epistemology and empiricism that there's no evidence for any of this stuff, and then I could relax and not have to worry. But it was quite a challenge through those years. But yeah, I would say probably in my early 20s is when I fully kind of left it behind, and then I did have this sort of crisis of meaning, like okay, well now not only where do I get my meaning from, but where do I get my morality from? And I think I think that's a huge problem. Not everyone obviously goes through the same kind of extreme experience that I did, but I think as a society, people are no longer believing a lot of this stuff from some of the Judeo-Christian beliefs and are latching on to anything that's going to sort of fill those roles. I think that's partly what gets us into these young kids, especially finding a sense of transcendence or meaning in gender identity and all of that.
Yeah, there was a really interesting part in the documentary where Lisa Marchiano is talking about, and she's a Jungian psychologist, and she's
Right.
talking about how kids are looking for this transcendence. And I mean, I was thinking, when I was listening to that part, that was really interesting. I was wondering kind of, and what's your take on this? Like, is that separate from the distress that some of the kids are feeling, like the extreme distress where they just can't exist in their skin, and they want to self harm and they want to just become a different person? But then what she was describing was a little bit different. It was like actually more of a positive yearning rather than like a negative escaping thing, where they're
Mm,
trying to get towards something, get towards this what she's talking about, this transcendent idea. And she pointed out even the word trans, it
right.
implies like transcending your physical reality, your material reality. But I
Yeah.
wonder through your research, what's your take on that? I guess, like, is that, do you think separate from the distress that they're feeling, or is that kind of all rolled up in one, or how do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, it could be one of the causes for the distress, or at least a part of the cause. And I think I agree with her that that desire to transcend, your mere physical reality, even though I don't believe in the supernatural, I do think it can be a positive quality if it turns you away from yourself and out towards something greater, whether that's a community or an art project, or just taking on the responsibility of life and achieving something, setting goals, doing something outside of yourself. I think that's really crucial and key just for everyone. And I think that a lot of these kids who are struggling with gender don't have that. I don't think that's the only reason, obviously, that they struggle or might want to self harm, but I do think that that is wrapped up in at least part of this trend and this craze for this, because I think that if they were more secure in themselves, and if they had a deeper sense of a real purpose and had real goals for themselves, and weren't spending so much time online, obsessing about their body and obsessing about who they could become, I think we'd see at least some of that drop away. We wouldn't see all of it drop away, obviously, because there are many, many reasons why people will feel distress about their bodies, but I'm convinced that that's one of them for sure.
Yeah, sometimes I think about like how teenagers, they really want an adventure, they really want a challenge, something that is like they want a mountain to climb, and they feel like their lives should be about something bigger, like the mundaneness of just going to school and following all the rules. They obviously they really want to buck that a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And maybe, gender transition, it's this challenge almost because it is so it has all these steps, like I have to transform myself, and it's the ultimate like makeover. And
Right.
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting line of thinking there that you're bringing up, like this desire for something bigger, something outside of themselves that they're not able to get from our society.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, so with your work, I do want to shift a little bit because I also really enjoy the street epistemology videos that
Mm.
you've worked on with Peter Boghossian,
Yeah.
and they're so interesting. How if people are listening who haven't seen them, it's where the concept is that basic sometimes it's well-known people or journalists or something like that, but sometimes it's just regular people from the street or from the university or wherever it is you're filming, and then Peter Boghossian, or I think you've also sometimes hosted them, will be there with a mic and lay out these propositions, like for example a human being can change their sex or something like that, and
Right.
then the people will choose where they stand. Are they going to stand on strongly disagree, slightly disagree, all the way down to strongly agree?
Hmm.
And then he gets people to say, why do you think that person stood on that spot? Or what do you think is their strongest argument? And it's the Socratic method. So it's pretty interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, tell us about your experience working with him on that project and, what you learned from that. What do you make of that whole like Socratic process with asking people, how does that work behind the scenes?
Yeah, no, we've done it a lot all over the world now. And some of the people in my series, like Helen Joyce and Mr. Minnow and Stella O'Malley, they've all done it with us last time we were in London, so that was a lot of fun. But yeah, we also get people on the street, random people, or just people in colleges. And for the most part, most people are really interested in it because I think often people, even in college, unfortunately, are not asked those questions. They're not asked about their epistemology or how they know what they think they know. And I've been interested in that for a long time. And Peter and I align in that way. And he's written whole books about it. And so the idea is taking that kind of critical thinking exercise out to the public. And most people don't stop and think about how they've arrived at their conclusions. They just believe what they believe for moral reasons, for emotional reasons, to be a part of their tribe or whatever. So it's really interesting when you can ask them, well, why do you believe that, or what would change your mind? What evidence would you need to see to move you from strongly agree to slightly disagree or whatever? And and so it's really interesting to see the vast array of people's responses and how they deal with that. And most of the time, most people really enjoy it. I think the craziest reactions we've got were all from Oregon, our home state, where we were outside of Portland State University and Oregon State University, and both of those places, and both of the topics had to do with gender or trans women in sports, and people just lost their minds. And in one of the videos, I had to blur the girls' faces because they threatened to like sue us at the end, and so it was pretty crazy. And then at one point, I suggested that we write there are only two genders. on the whiteboard that we use to. That's how people can see the claim that people are using for the game. And we got flipped off from the rooftop, and then they came down and mobbed us. I think it was about 19 people preaching to us about their how much harm we're doing, and all that. So it's been, yeah, it's a fascinating exercise, and most of the time people really enjoy it, but sometimes you'll get that whatever it is, 8 to 12% of super crazy far left nut jobs.
Yeah, I think I saw the video where they were shouting from the rooftop.
Yeah.
And then I didn't know though that they came down and confronted you. How did that
Oh
end? How
yeah.
did that confrontation end?
Yeah, you can see it on YouTube. I started filming with a GoPro, and I think Reed, who also films with us, used his phone, and we captured that. Yeah, it was a few more people showed up, so I think it was about 19 or 20 in total. But at first, they expressed interest in, they're like, "Oh, we're just so curious what you're doing." But then it very quickly devolved in, "No, we're not curious. We just want to disrupt and dismantle." These are two key words that woke people use a lot. They just wanted to disrupt what we were doing because they saw all the harm being done. And so Peter just asked them, "Well, what harm is being done?" And they're saying things like, "Oh, well, some trans students had to go home because they felt threatened." And I was thinking, that is so amazing. It's like a magic spell, having a few words on a whiteboard. It's not like we had a swastika and we're like saying we're pro-Nazi. It was just something about gender, and that was enough for them to feel unsafe. I mean, maybe they were lying. The social workers that came down, they could have also just been lying. But if they weren't, that's even worse, because then people literally felt like they had to leave the premises and go home, even though we were outside. We weren't blocking any walkways. We were, not shouting at anyone. But that was amazing to me. And they said that we were causing harm by playing this critical thinking game, but the reality is those people were causing harm by coddling these people and saying, yes, you should go home because, yeah, this is a threat. And I don't know what they said behind closed doors, but you can imagine that they were encouraging the people who felt threatened or harmed, and justifying that, because that's essentially what they communicated to us. So I don't think that intervention was helpful for anyone, except for people online and elsewhere to see how some of these people's minds are so closed that they're not even willing to answer a few questions or engage in real dialogue. Because that wasn't a real dialogue. It was, like I said, it was preaching. It was just people preaching to us about their cult. And, they didn't like the questions that Peter asked, and they ended up leaving kind of upset. Um,
Did they yell at you?
I wouldn't say they yelled. There was one guy that yelled something, but for the most part, they didn't yell. It was just more of the language. One of the first things, there was one guy, the rest were women, and the one guy said, I don't know why 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white guys are talking about gender. Like, what does our race have to do with, talking about gender? Like, how is that relevant? So no, it was just the language they used that was bizarre, and they effectively did disrupt us and dismantle us for at least 20 minutes, but then we kept going once they left. So
Interesting. And then were there different reactions, like a variety of reactions from the students?
well, I don't know how the students respond. I mean, there were some that were there playing the game, and they were all just like, kind of shocked that it happened. But the most of the reactions were online, and most of them were quite positive in the way that Peter handled it. And um, yeah, I think most people were just shocked that this happened and were supportive of what we were doing, for sure.
Yeah. And then for you personally, do you define yourself on, the political spectrum, on the left-right spectrum? Do you have a place where you situate yourself?
I mean, not really. I grew up, on the Christian right, and then once I left that behind, I became kind of an angry atheist anarchist, and then I quickly realized that also didn't really make any sense. So, I've kind of shifted back and forth, but yeah, I'm politically homeless. I'm happy to be politically homeless. I'm just fairly moderate, and I just like to do whatever is, or vote in whatever way is most congruent with my philosophy and life. And so, yeah, I don't really identify on the left or the right.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Going back to when you said that you kind of had to rediscover where you found morality, like the source of your morality or your moral code, Where did you end up, finding that? What was that? Where did you come down on that?
Yeah, I was reading a lot of Nietzsche and a lot of, which is not necessarily the best place to get your morality, but I really enjoyed a lot of what he said, and then I got interested in kind of Eastern philosophy, Buddhism and Taoism, and ultimately you see a lot of similarities in these moral values that uh, kind of replicate themselves across cultures and across time, and realize that human beings just naturally develop a kind of morality. It differs from group to group a little bit, and it differs in how it's expressed, certainly in different religions. But I think we're all just naturally. I think morality is inherent in human beings. So that was, part of it was just a realization that we're all just, and unless a person is a sociopath, that we just have morality kind of built into us. But in terms of my specific values, yeah, I took a lot from the philosophy that I was reading, and certain parts of Eastern traditions and that sort of thing. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily from one particular place.
Okay, interesting. And then when you described kind of letting go or leaving behind the belief in hell, that really, you described gave you a lot of anxiety. Was
Hmm.
that kind of all at once? Like, was there one moment where you felt it lift off your shoulders, or was it a gradual process?
It's a good question. It was quite a while ago now, so I don't remember the details. I just remember sort of coming across, um, what was it? It might have been eventually reading some of like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and people like that, and as well as like William James and other philosophers talk about epistemology and empiricism. So yeah, no, I think it was a bit more of a gradual process, but is but eventually it was like a weight slowly lifting when I realized that I just didn't need to be afraid of things that had no evidence for their existence.
Hmm. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that because it really kind of mirrors the street epistemology method where,
Hmm.
the question is asked, like you brought up earlier, what would it take to change your mind on this? What evidence would you have to see to
Right.
change your mind? And it sounds like you've really gone through that process in your own life, which is pretty interesting that you've really used it. I mean, would you say that that's accurate? Like you've used that process personally?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't in any kind of formalized way. I wasn't going through a philosophy course, or I didn't, the game didn't exist then or anything. But yeah, I just I'm naturally inquisitive and somewhat self-reflective, or at least I try to be. And so, um, when you start to learn about the basics of how our minds work, and what is a good basis for a belief, then I think most of us will be interested in kind of challenging our preconceptions, especially when you start to learn about like cognitive biases and that sort of thing. So it was really a combination of reading, a lot of different philosophy books, as well as some cognitive science and psychology, and just reevaluating, my approach to my own beliefs and to belief in general, that kind of led me down that path.
Mhm. Okay, interesting. And then, so for your documentary, Uncomfortable Truths, the first episode you get into, it kind of starts with, so-called gender critical people, which I kind of
Mhm.
have started not using that term as much because it sounds like its own ideology, but really just people who are critical of gender. They come from different, ideologies or idea patterns, whatever it is, whatever you want
Right.
to call it. But talking about how there are two sexes, this is very well defined. We've got Helen Joyce, and then you talk to Buck Angel, who,
Mhm.
for people who listening, probably know exactly who Buck Angel is, but trans man. So, a woman who identifies as a man, looks like a man. So, you've got Buck Angel talking about how this is a travesty, that this is being done to kids, and that people should not be transitioning as children, all of that. And then you go into showing the hardcore pro gender transition side, and you show how it's infiltrated into the mainstream and the mainstream media promoting these talking points.
Yeah.
And then you also have Stella O'Malley and Lisa Marchiano with the therapy side of it. Where are you going to go next? Like, can you give us a preview of what the next episodes are going to look like?
Yeah. So the next one will be all about the parents and their perspective and what they've had to deal with. So I interviewed three mothers, two of whom had sons that identified as the opposite sex, and one had a daughter that was starting to identify as the opposite sex. And they each have their own stories about what happened to them, and they're all very interesting and they're very different, but they have a lot of overlapping kind of themes. So my goal is to tell their stories. One, because I think they're interesting and moving, and two, because I think excuse me, my hope is that it will help other parents who are dealing with this and other kids who are thinking about going down this path to maybe pause a little bit and to hopefully learn a little bit from their stories. So that'll be kind of the main thrust of the second episode, is these different stories of what have happened to these families, and then of course with some talking heads and advice from the different therapists and different people who are experts in this as well. And then the third episode, my plan is to talk more about what's happening, to women's sports and in women's prisons, and to gay people, how the trans ideology is kind of infecting these other areas, and what it's doing to broader society and gender relations more generally.
Hmm. Okay, and what kind of reaction have you gotten? Have you gotten like a ton of angry activists? I know you mentioned you're still kind of going to, I guess, launch it to a bigger audience, so
Yeah.
maybe you haven't dealt with that quite yet, but what has the reaction been like?
Yeah. So I'm sure the reaction will be different once it gets more views, but because it's not on YouTube or a public platform yet. But yeah, so the reaction has been mostly really good. What was actually a bit depressing was the negative reactions that I got from the so-called gender critical side, the people who I would otherwise agree with for the most part. And as you kind of mentioned, it sort of is turning into its own ideology. I'm sure you probably talked to Stella and other people about this, but I showed the first episode at the last GenSpect conference. GenSpect is an organization that was founded by Stella O'Malley and others, and that's where excuse me, where I got a lot of the initial interviews a year ago in Ireland, and then they did a follow up conference in Denver last year, and Stella let me show the first episode, and it seemed like most people really liked it. It got a standing ovation, which was great. I felt really good. But then we did a Q&A afterwards, and people immediately started jumping on the fact that Buck Angel was in the series and excoriating me for that. And one woman's even like holding up her phone showing pictures of Buck being naked because Buck has done porn, which I don't care about. Um, and and so I started getting a lot of hate, and that was actually really depressing for a few months because none of them could say one thing that they disagreed with in the series or in the episode. None of them brought up one point that was made or anything that Buck said that they took issue with. Not one thing. It was just, this person is associated with this. I don't like this person's past or something about this person. Therefore, it's people were telling me to re-edit the film and to like shoot new interviews for it. I've never had that happen. I've never had someone come up to me and be like, "Oh, you need to change your movie. You need to put somebody else in there." I was like, okay, well, do you want to pay me thousands of dollars to do this? Like, do you think that that's one? Do you think that I'm interested in that? And two, do you think that that's an easy thing to do? So yeah, that was kind of ridiculous. And then I filmed a follow up conversation with Stella about that and about how she's been attacked by this same side viciously. I mean, just viciously. And that just got tons of hate on Twitter. I mean, I didn't even read the comments. I mean, clips of our conversation got shared tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times, actually, with hundreds of just nasty comments. And the best that I can really do is like poke fun at a few of the people and then just block them or ignore them because even on that side, like frankly, they're also not interested often in real conversation. They just want to take pot shots or say, hurtful things or whatever. And yeah, so that was really kind of depressing to see that same kind of like dogmatism and anger. But they think that they're, again, like just like some of the trans activists, they think they're on the right side of history, and they think, oh, if I call Buck Angel, who's a biological woman, if I call Buck Angel a he, then that's somehow directly going to lead to young girls transitioning. You know, it's like I just so yeah, the long answer, but yeah, so it's been kind of a mixed. I've gotten more hate from the people who ostensibly agree with pretty much most of it than from trans activists, but I don't know that many trans activists have seen it yet. So
Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've talked about with a lot of different guests that I've had is this concept of people, of activists who don't really want to win because their whole
mm,
emotional life or even their career is staked upon this one issue.
yeah,
So if this all gets turned around, they kind of lose what they've got going for them, what's kind of become their identity.
right,
And I think a lot of people who are fighting this, they kind of feel their grip on it like loosening, like they feel their control loosening because it's just getting out to all these other people. They're not all radical feminists anymore who are talking about this issue, and people
right,
aren't all going to agree with radical feminist tenets. And frankly, radical feminist ideology is never going to be in the mainstream in any way. So they cannot let go of that. Like they cannot let go of this feeling of control. And it really can be quite frustrating when, you are the person trying to speak out. Like I've been attacked when I was first canceled. I was doing a lot of kind of like this trying to compromise with my language and using preferred pronouns, and the comments I got that were so controlling, like, no, you can't say this. And I was like, listen, I'm, a free speech advocate, so I'm not going
yeah,
to appreciate someone telling me what I should be saying, especially when they are the anonymous commenter. But
right,
and I think, and then, I ultimately came to my own conclusion that I I only used sexed pronouns now, or I kind of
mm,
maybe like avoid saying them because
right,
I don't want to cause unnecessary offense to someone like Buck Angel, who I really respect and I really
yeah,
like Buck Angel. But it actually, I think, ironically took me longer to get to that position because the people were badgering me so much about it. And I
yeah,
had that kind of contrarian feeling of like, don't tell me what to say. I'm not going to just
totally,
say what you want me to say. So I think they should take note of that it kind of has the opposite effect sometimes, which
yeah.
is interesting.
I'm not sure they
But
care, but yeah,
right, they don't. Yeah, I think you're right. They probably don't care because they want that friction, kind of maybe.
the fight, yeah,
hmm
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, what was that like for you? Were you shocked at that, or were you like, oh yeah, this is more of the same of what I've been dealing with?
I guess I shouldn't be shocked because it's clearly a feature of human cognition when people get together in groups and they become tribal, psychologically tribal. It shouldn't shock me, but it always does. I guess I was just hoping with something so, as we talked about at the beginning, so detrimental towards children and women in particular. Like, I don't know, it just seems to me, and this is a point that I made during the Q&A, that I'm focused on, the most important issues to me are protecting children and, like women's only spaces, what pronouns people use or how people deal with other parts of this. I'm sure people can make good points on how other things are important, but to me those are the most important things, and if we agree on that, then why don't we all just push in the same direction? But it's not good enough for certain people, that because people become puritanical, I think, and regardless of what the movement is, there's people sort of lay out a foundational set of beliefs, and then they need to stick to those beliefs, the people who really adhere to them, and anything that questions it or is a little bit outside of it or doesn't completely conform is anathema, and we have to sort of edge those people out, like me. And so, like I said, whatever community I'm a part of, I just find myself getting in trouble, but I don't care. I mean, I'm anti-authoritarian, so if someone's going to tell me what pronouns I can use, whether they're, some crazy trans activist or some crazy radical feminist activist, they can just fuck off. I don't care.
Yeah. And then, so I'm curious for you, with all the people you interviewed, so many amazing people, was there one that really stuck out for you where you were like, oh, this, you know, turned on a light bulb or made something click for you? Like, is there something that really stands out among your interviews?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did so many interviews in such a short period of time on little sleep. So there there were a lot of interviews like that where I learned about something that I had no idea about, or um, I really enjoyed interviewing Helen Joyce because she's just so on top of it, and it's got a forceful way of speaking. Um, I think some of the information I was learning from Michael Biggs, the sociologist, was pretty disturbing and eye opening about just the history of transition, and people basing all of their decisions on in terms of WPATH and other organizations for advancing the cause of children transitioning. They're all basing on the Dutch protocol, or the Dutch study, which is fallacious and has a lot of problems. But yeah, I don't know. There were many eye-opening moments, and I enjoyed all the interviews. Trying to think if there's one in particular that stands out over the others, but I don't know. They were all great, and everyone had something really. I guess generally, what stood out to me was I was pretty new to the world of gender identity and these interviews, even though I'd read some books and watched some interviews, but in the mainstream, or certainly among the left mainstream, the people who speak out against this stuff are called bigots, and they're called transphobes, and they, supposedly they hate trans people. But that's what stood out the most, is that none of the people I interviewed, I mean, they were all very compassionate. They're all very concerned about people who identify as trans, or people who think they should identify as trans, and none of them were bigoted or angry or hateful. I mean, it's just very clear that everyone was very kind and caring and genuinely care about people, and that's why they're doing this. Otherwise, they wouldn't put themselves through the kind of you know difficulties that come along with talking about these issues.
Mm. Do you think transphobia is a real thing?
Yeah, I guess so. It's sort of. I mean, I don't think trans is a real thing, in the sense that I don't think there is a particular category of person that is trans. I think just people suffer from distress about their sex bodies. But in terms of, but just taking that term sort of loosely, yeah, I'm sure, especially with more right wing, more religious conservatives, they see a gender non-conforming person, or a person who's sort of identifying as trans or appearing as the opposite sex. Yeah, they just, as the same thing happened with two guys holding hands or whatever. I think there certainly can be that kind of fear or disgust mechanism that kicks in, and then people can be treated, in particular, men dressing as women. So yeah, I don't think it's as kind of cut and dried or black and white as a lot of people say it is, but sure, I can see that as a real phenomenon.
Okay, yeah. And then in terms of like that disgust reaction, I find that really interesting that that you brought up that do you think that is something that's inherent to us? Like you mentioned that you think morality is inherent to humanity. And do you think that disgust response is also, or do you think that is something that maybe we pick up from our social environments or something like that?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a natural inclination, or a natural part of our cognition, because it keeps us from, or at least in the in the past and in the present, when you see something that smells bad, or you get close to some rotten food, you're disgusted by it. Jonathan Haidt has done some really interesting work on the morality of disgust, and asked a lot of very interesting questions that sort of reveal people's patterns of behavior, and how disgust enters into their moral equations. So I definitely recommend people look into that. But yeah, I think disgust can be intertwined with morality, and I think it's really interesting how that works. But yeah, I think if we didn't have a disgust mechanism in our brains, then we probably wouldn't be alive. I think it helps keep us away from things that are contaminated, but I think it can be kind of overplayed, and certainly exacerbated by certain social norms or social conditioning. But I do think it's just a natural part of how we operate.
Mm. Do you think that we should ever try to curtail it in certain situations?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the gay marriage, for instance, is one of them. If someone is against it because it feels disgusting to them, but they can't quite articulate why it's bad, or they just say, oh, we need this family structure that we've always had. I think in those cases, I'm not gay, so it doesn't. I don't know. Disgust is a strong word, but I don't particularly like watching two men make out. But I'm also not going to want to make that illegal or think that it's harmful or whatever. So I think that's a case in which you just have to, like, regardless of whatever the emotional reaction is to that sort of thing, you do have to kind of curtail that and um, it depends on the setting, of course, but yeah, I think there are certain situations where it doesn't make sense to listen to your own reaction. You do have to kind of override that at certain times.
Okay, yeah. And then what do you think of the whole natural, like it's natural or it's not natural argument? Like, people do use that a lot about homosexuality. They say like it's not natural.
Right.
People who are against it, they'll say it's not natural. And then also when it comes to like transitioning, like of course
Mhm.
it's not natural to get all these procedures and hormones and drugs and things. So there's kind of a whole spectrum of the way people use that argument, the natural argument. But what do you
Yeah.
think of that whole concept?
Yeah. When it comes to homosexuality, I think Douglas Murray said something interesting in one of his books. I think it was The Madness of Crowds, about how Douglas is gay, but he was open to this idea that maybe it isn't. Maybe people aren't born this way, and I think, yeah. So what? I mean, if they are or aren't, why does it really matter? I think maybe people, the gay rights movement, use that kind of as a slogan, like we were born this way, to get recognition and to get certain laws passed. And I think that makes sense strategically. Whether or not that's true, I have no idea. I think it's true, but I have no idea. If it's not, again, I don't think that should keep women from being able to love women and men. I just don't see how that's a problem. When it comes to the trans thing, I interviewed a detransitioner named Camille Kiefel, who's become something of a friend, and she made an interesting point, which is that being gay doesn't require any kind of medicalization. You just love the person you love, and that's it. But being trans does, and so it is very different in that sense. So if it's natural, yeah, I don't know why you'd need unnatural interventions or remedies to solidify it. It's kind of a oxymoronic in a way.
Yeah, there is that big contradiction there, right? Like, well, Bruce Jenner always was a woman, but he's got to get like breast implants and all these things in order to be his true self. So
Right.
that's definitely a huge contradiction there. And I mean, what's next for you? Like, just continuing to push the documentary? Like, are you going to stay focused on gender? Is that going to be your beat? Are you still going to expand into other things?
Yeah, I probably won't stay in this world for too long. It's such a toxic world from both sides, that I can't imagine wanting to just exist there. But yeah, I'm working on the next episode, and I'm now traveling and working full time with Peter Boghossian, so it's everything is sort of slowed down for me. But I hope to finish this. Then I have another film that I've been making that it's all about epistemology, and it's sort of based around Peter's second book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, where I bring people together from both sides of an issue to talk it through and to improve their conversations, and to talk about polarization and tribalism and psychology and all the other things that I'm interested in. So I hope to get back to that and finish that, and then eventually I would really like to get back to fiction. And my first film was fictional. It was a dark comedy, and so I'd like to shift away from documentaries and get back to making something a bit more creative and more, I don't know, less toxic, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense, definitely. Awesome. Okay, so Travis, where do you want to direct people to find your work? What should they make sure to look up to find out more about you?
Yeah, so people can check me out on YouTube at The Signal Productions. If you look that up, you can find my previous series, The Woke Reformation, and then some clips from Uncomfortable Truths. And then if they want to support me on locals, it's just travisbrown.locals.com, where I put out a lot of long form interviews and extra content and stuff like that.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to link those below. So thank you so much, Travis. It was really interesting getting to talk to you and hear your perspective, and I am definitely looking forward to seeing the next episodes in the series. So yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me.